We are back, and we are joined now by Craig Gent, writer, editor, researcher, director at Novara Media, and author of Cyberboss, The Rise of Algorithmic Management and the New Struggle for Control at Work. Craig, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So there is a lot to talk about, I think, about AI, but not the talk that you'll usually hear in the media, because it's usually about, oh no, kids are going to cheat on their homework, or it's going to become sentient and take over the planet, like some sci-fi movie, or it's about, replacing human beings, I guess. And there's some truth to that part, but usually the most highly publicized fears, I feel like, about AI are centered around how powerful and investment worthy that technology is. But your book talks about how AI has already had an effect on the workplace, and that may be a good place to start. How have workers in these particular sectors that you profile here in your book been affected by the rise of AI?
So in the book, I primarily look at logistical workplaces, but really because they're at the apex of a nexus of concerns that involve the use of precarious contracts, but also the use of technology over workers and to control the work process itself. So maybe historically we've often thought about technology being used to replace workers. In this book, I explore cases where what's really happening is that technology is being used to manage workers and to ramp up their performance to ever greater levels.
And so in terms of enhancing workers, what are the prime examples that people may be familiar with in their daily life?
It can be like carrot and stick. So like, some of the sort of carrot type approaches can be sort of gamification. So people who work with in the gig economy, for example, might have gamified kind of aspects of the interface that they interact with there to kind of like lure them into working harder and longer. But it's also the case that they use sort of very punitively. One workplace that I looked at, the worker would be tracked and monitored all day long by kind of a wristwatch. It's kind of more like a big sort of smartphone attached to his forearm. And he'd work through the day, and then the following morning he'd wake up to a text message saying whether that day's shift was confirmed or cancelled on the basis of the productivity score that he hit the day before. And so it had real kind of like work or not work consequences for him.
And so that's like more of a replacement of a management structure via AI, almost. Can you talk about that? Because that is a replacement of, managers they don't own the means of production. They're still workers. What does that mean for that class above, I guess, the people doing the physical work?
Yeah, so like this kind of AI is algorithmic management, which has been referred to as like the automation of management as a kind of shorthand. But it definitely has like a big effect, like number of big effects like on the workplace. There's this kind of like hollowing out of like managers' knowledge, where even supervisors within the work process, like they're not kind of there to like oversee so much as they are to advise people on how best to work to this kind of algorithmic system. Indeed, lots of workplaces I looked at, workers were frequently advised to just trust the system because, the workers can be wrong about something. The managers might even be wrong about something because they're human, but the inhuman technological system cannot be wrong and is infallible. And it also has the effect that there's this kind of plausible deniability that quite bad things can happen to workers, but it's blamed on the algorithm rather than being blamed on the actual kind of like power structures that are deploying the algorithm as such. So although algorithmic management is all about the real-time monitoring, tracking, assessing of work performance and of workers, the effect itself is a managerial effect, same as it ever was in a way. It's just that it's a strategy that's sort of deployed to obfuscate the power relations of the workplace.
Does it also physically Separate management from the workforce, so there's less of an understanding from management about the practical problems that the workforce is facing on a day-to-day basis, and it's more just about gaming. When you gamify like someone's workplace and an incentive structure in that way, then the managers are just there to manage the gaming of the game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, yeah, you see this in a number of workplaces where, the point of management, like throughout the work process, so whether this is, people riding for, a gig economy company delivering food, or whether they're like working at Amazon, they're not interacting with managers with a sort of like a high degree of regularity. Their main kind of like interaction with management is actually interaction with an interface, like either an app in the case of a gig economy, or interacting with like a handheld scanner, or that kind of sort of like screen-based interface in those kinds of work that is like instructing them and sort of like telling them what to do. And if they've got any kind of like problems, it's not like they can kind of like readily take it up with the thing that is giving them the problem. Like they just have the interface to interact with.
And in terms of atomizing workers, does this also have a chilling effect on organizing when you kind of put an algorithm or computerization in the middle of the workforce? It also probably, as I was kind of alluding to with the management piece, it physically separates them as well.
Yeah, so it absolutely physically enables the physical separation of workers as well. So, I mean, you mentioned at the top there about AI being kind of investment worthy, and definitely one of the things that makes these technologies investment worthy in a work context is that they separate workers and make work both an affectively sort of dull experience, or at least monotonous experience, where the whole workflow is kind of governed by these sort of algorithmic steps and processes that sort of loop and loop and loop to make up the entire working day with very little sort of variation. But also that they enable workers to be organized like throughout a workplace in such a way that they have very little interaction with each other. And the combination of these two things together robs workers of time and also of collectivity, which of course are two prerequisites for any kind of taking action together.
And what I also found fascinating about your book is, in terms of taking action, there are other ways that workers will rebel, for lack of a better phrase, against these oppressive technological management systems. One of them was pretty funny, involving DVDs and Star Wars, but there are some examples, if you don't mind telling a few anecdotes from your book.
No, this is everyone's favorite one, actually, funny enough. But so like with the management, the algorithmic management system like creates this scenario where work is very sort of tightly controlled and administrated by this technology, this set of technologies. And many workers that I spoke to for the book would try to find any way that they could leverage agency within the workplace. And so often this centered around time and unsanctioned breaks, for example. So in one workplace that I encountered, the workers had discovered a code that they could press into their scanner, and it would momentarily sort of take them out of the productivity calculation, and this would allow them to go and take an unsanctioned break without any kind of like decline in their productivity score by the end of the day. And to the point, this was getting shared around to the point where one worker told me that he'd go to the break room and you see someone else who's not supposed to be there, and they kind of like nod at each other, and it's like, okay, you know that like who's been sharing the code. So like unsanctioned breaks and sort of reclamation of time was quite a big one. But this the DVD case that you're sort of alluding to is that I spoke to a worker who worked in an online shopping department for a major supermarket. So these are the people who go around the store. It works different places. Sometimes they might be around a warehouse. In this case, he went around a regular store, but out of hours, to collect people's online supermarket deliveries that they've placed on the internet. And as he's going around, he realizes that the one small piece of agency that he has in his role is that he can choose the substitution if an item isn't present. And not only that, but when he chooses the substitution, if he substitutes an item and says it's not there, so I've chosen this one, then all of the workers behind him who would have been going to choose, item A will instead be choosing item B, because he's also updating the stock inventory. So it's actually quite a bit of agency that he's got suddenly over the process of all these workers collecting people's goods. And he decides that every time someone orders a DVD of any kind, he's going to substitute it for Rogue One, a Star Wars story, for the reason that, in his words, it's a sick film and everyone should see it. And it gives him enough plausible. Do you know what? Like, I actually tried to watch that film 3 times now, and each time I fell asleep in the cinema.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, anyway, but he was convinced, and as is his right, and he
Exactly.
would substitute the DVD for Star Wars Rogue One, because in his words, there's a sort of like a latitude there. It's a Disney film, it's a kids film, it's an action film, but someone be ordering like Peppa Pig, and they're getting Star Wars Rogue One, which is quite amusing. And so, I mean, I said to him, like, is this not just sort of churlish? And he said, actually, it's serious to me. He says, away from the jokes, this is about dignity, because I'm paid so badly and my work is so tightly controlled that I feel compelled, for the sake of my own dignity, to make every moment that I'm at work cost that little bit more.
And can I ask, was that worker in the UK or?
This was a worker in the UK, yeah.
Yeah. So if you don't mind talking a little bit about the role of unions in this, because in the United States we have seen Amazon union busting over and over again. It's caught the attention of the National Labor Relations Board, but the problem with our system is that basically these mega corporations have enough money to eat the fees that are levied at them by our enforcement agencies, and they can just tie up these unions, especially if they're smaller startup unions, in litigation and all that kind of stuff. The power differential, it's just so massive that they just engage in anti-labor practices that are flagrantly against the law and then eat the fines. Starbucks also experienced or practiced some of this. So I'm not as familiar with the percentage of labor that's unionized that works at a place like Amazon in the UK, but how do unions play into this?
Okay, so like the unions are, clearly aware of like what's happening. But one of my starting points for the book was an observation that, despite the fact that this kind of whole set of concerns and this sort of like around this like draconian sort of work practices that seem to, give us very bleak prospects for the future, despite the understanding that they are technologically enabled in some way, all of the demands that I was seeing and all of the sort of strategy that I was seeing was around precariousness, so primarily pay and contracts, and recognition agreements, and seeking recognition agreements with employers. And this kind of strategy of always sort of prioritizing the recognition agreement would lead to some kind of unintended consequences, honestly. So, for example, one workplace that I looked at, they put all of their eggs into the basket of trying to get a recognition agreement, only to have a sort of smaller, more of a yellow union sign a kind of sweetheart deal with the employer, which then forced the first union kind of out of their altogether. And so they hadn't even really begun organizing yet, and they'd put all these resources into recognition, and then the employer had sort of turned around and signed a deal with a different, more compliant union. But then that union that got messed over in the first case did the same thing to a sort of smaller, more grassroots union at Uber, actually. And that union signed a massive deal. This was a GMB, signed a massive deal with Uber, and sort of sang it from the rooftops as the first like major recognition agreement with a platform, a gig economy platform. But the trade-off was any mechanism of a pay bargaining. And as you might expect, then Uber then was suddenly like putting adverts onto podcasts saying, oh, we're good now because like we're partnered with the GMB union. And it was just a sort of big sort of PR stunt, So I think in the book, one of the things that's become or been taken as a sort of kind of provocative, but like, I hope it's kind of like a friendly kind of criticism, is that I do think that within unions and among trade unionists, and I count myself in that, we need to think differently about how we've been doing things, because I think prioritizing recognition, prioritizing things that kind of exist in these kinds of like boardrooms is playing into the hands of managers, and we're actually never getting into the question of technology whatsoever. And so the demands around the actual use of technology, certainly in this country, are really kind of nowhere. At most, they're kind of stuck on the thorns of like debates around like transparency and making the processes more transparent, which I think is a bit misleading, because really there is no section of computer code in an algorithmic management system that you could hope to shed light on that would explain in the new power dynamics of the workplace. You need to speak to the workers for that. One worker I spoke to, he said that his union did have a recognition agreement with his employer, and the union had agreed for time and motion studies to be done on the workers, and it ended up with him having a heavier trolley to push around, and he was never consulted over any of it. So unionization in and of itself is I think we need to sort of move the conversation on a little bit to like the actual question of like union strategy. And one of the reasons why I look at these alternative forms of rebellion is not because I think that they themselves are the answer, but notably many of the people I spoke to who were engaged in them were not enamored with their unions, despite the fact that they were in them, and saw it as a more direct way to reclaim agency themselves. I would make the argument that unions need to be widening the repertoire of tactics and strategies that they're willing to engage in.
And I guess that brings me to the question of when the demands, I guess hypothetically, when the demands move from basically taking over some of the technology here, or from transparency or for recognition, to owning a piece of the pie. I mean, that kind of thing sounds pretty a long ways away in the United States, but there are these big tech companies operate elsewhere, as you say. Could that be a path forward in terms of more ambition from union demands?
I'm unsure, and I'm kind of yet to be convinced of the argument that many unions the world over are making, in which they say, often as a line of defense, actually, they'll say, we're not anti-technology, we just want to share the benefit and make sure workers share the benefit. I'm not actually convinced that there is a great benefit of these particular technologies for workers to share in, because the technologies are designed to be anti-worker in the first place. So actually, I feel like in some cases, what ought to be the demand is some level, honestly, of like suppression or like pulling back from where we've got to. This could happen in a number of ways. So I know that in France, for example, unions have still used the kind of like legislative route, but what they've done is they've lobbied for a minimum order fee, so you can't get free delivery, and this is encouraging people to sort of group their orders together on Amazon, for example, and taking that kind of last mile pressure off of some of those supply chains that is enabling a bit more of a conversation around this kind of seemingly technological but really managerial pressure to absolutely optimize everything, which of course just squeezes labor.
And in terms of this, as it relates to gig work in particular, is that what makes this technology so unique too? Is that it exploits workers in this particular way, where gig work is a way for these companies to not provide any benefits for their employees and save a lot of money, and it seems like at least the usage of this automation is an extension of that way that the workforce has been conceptualized.
It's definitely the case that these technologies are being deployed, many instances, maybe even the majority, to facilitate precarious working conditions. I would agree with that. However, I would probably also go a little further and say that I don't feel that there's really any amount of fixing wages or contract conditions that would improve the way that it feels to work with these technologies, which is fundamentally that it kind of robs people of time, agency, and dignity. And so I feel like we almost need a sort of a different sort of starting point in that sense. I think that we often focus on pay because it's where we've become accustomed to beginning within sort of union struggles. But I think that when I spoke to many workers for the book, they're really complaining of feeling like they've been stripped of dignity. And I think that's something that we have to kind of take up, because what's novel to the technology is not so much like what it can enable, but it's the fact that it invokes an enormous amount of computing power. It's really the real-time nature of the technologies. They can track and monitor and redirect workers in real time, and it's putting that up against you and me. And it's not just happening in gig work, and it's not just happening in the Amazon fulfillment center. It's increasingly happening it happens in McDonald's now. It's happening in Starbucks, like it's happening in offices. Explorations being done on the algorithmic management of emotion through emotion trackers, and sort of like wearable technologies that we've previously associated with health, such as the use of sort of Fitbits, sleep monitoring.
Or motion trackers. Sorry, I want to make
emotion.
Sure. Emotion. Oh,
emotion.
Okay. Well, back in my camp days, I'd get the $10 that my mom sent me and buy a mood ring at the store. I guess now mood rings for workers, because if you're not happy when you're working, you better make yourself happy.
That's right. I mean, you can get, you get the, I presume you have them in the US too. You have the rings now that, monitor your health while you sleep, supposedly.
Right.
But, think of these same technologies, these kinds of wearables that really become kind of like quite intimate technologies in a way, being controlled by your boss instead.
Oh boy. Well, extremely dystopian, but also really informative. The book is called Cyberboss, The Rise of Algorithmic Management and the New Struggle for Control at Work. Craig, Gent, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.